if my wife has a hunch about something, or if she says we should do something, the times I haven't listened, they've backfired.
Right. It took me almost a decade to learn that. And in the process, I was becoming Catholic and she wasn't. She wouldn't. And when she did, I thought, well, it's going to be hunky-dory. She'll, fall in line and follow me. And it didn't work that way. When we moved to Steubenville, we had this really dark wall-to-wall Italian carpeting that was newly put in by the previous owners that we were assured would last 30 years. But it made our house seemed cavernous, but I didn't care. It would last 30 years. And so when she got the idea that we would brighten the home and get other carpeting and rip this one out, I went ballistic, and I'm like, we can't afford that,
Yeah.
And then I realized I can't afford not to listen to her. And I remember the day when I said to her something that seemed like a revelation. Kimberly, I have never gone wrong trusting you. And I've never done right distrusting you. Even when I could prove you were wrong, that just made me more wrong. And she looked at me and she's like, we're on the same team. You finally figured that out. And I'm like, yeah. And boy, I've never looked back. I still have to learn by making mistakes, but that was one of the biggest life lessons I ever learned. And it was a source of joy back then and still is.
I think a lot of men, they understand that the scriptures say that the father is supposed to be the head of the household. And this is a true statement, right? A truth the scriptures teach. And yet, so on one hand, we experience how men are portrayed in the media, maybe as overbearing or tyrannical. And then on the other hand, you've got this feminism movement that says, no, men and women are basically interchangeable. How would you suggest that a man take responsibility for his household, be the head of the household, the priest of the household, while at the same time having that humility that you're talking about? Because I would imagine one of the reasons that prevented me and maybe prevented you from listening to our wives is there's an authority that I ought to have in the household and that my wife even wants me to have, even if she's right more than I am.
Wow. Okay. So 3 thoughts just popped into my mind. The preliminary thought before the other 3 is my own pride, my own insecurity that makes it so hard for me to lead in a way that is natural for them to follow. And so I remember years ago hearing a phrase, I forget who used it. It might have been one of the Naramore brothers, Clyde or Bruce, who were evangelical Christian psychologists, but the phrase was non-anxious leadership.
Oh, that's good.
And I remember when I heard that, I latched onto it thinking, okay, even if it takes me 10 years to attain that, that's my goal. Because leadership came naturally for me because of pride as a man, But anxious leadership is like the worst of both worlds, because when you try to lead anxiously, everybody just feels your angst and they don't want to follow you because everybody's on edge. And so, if I get to the moment when I'm not anxious, well, it's easy to fall back into the easy chair and just not want to lead at that point. So it's a combination of non-anxious leadership. It seems to me that is the essence of fatherhood. And I saw it in my father-in-law. Dr. Jerry Kirk was the
Good
exemplar. Man. Oh, my. We used to compare him to like 4 or 5 people, to Dick Van Dyke, to Jimmy Stewart, to Ronald Reagan, and Fred McMurray.
Wow.
He was just unhateable.
Yes.
And he would lead non-anxiously, and I would learn from him. I would also end up feeling crushed with anxiety because I was so unable to do it like he did it so naturally. But over the years and through our friendship, he just set an example I strive to emulate. The second thought that comes to my mind is from Ephesians 5, where we hear that Christ is the head of the church, and so the man is the head of the home. I think of Pius XI and an encyclical that he wrote, Casti Connubii, back in 1930 on Christian marriage. It's on the internet. It's one of the most neglected classics of 20th century papal teaching. It was in direct response to the Lambeth Convention, as you might know, which the Anglicans had just justified contraception for the first time under, extraordinary circumstances, of course. But, that becomes that little loophole becomes something that trucks can drive through. But in the response, he's not just explaining why the church says it's wrong to, practice contraception, but he explains this vision of marriage. I remember reading it before I became a Catholic, and he draws from Ephesians 5 and points out how the man has primacy in the order of authority as the head. But then, quoting St. Augustine, he refers to the fact that if the man is the head of the home, then the woman is the heart of the home. That if man has primacy in the order of authority, the woman has primacy in the order of love. And I'm like, okay, there are two orders that are not in competition, nor are they separated from one another, because authority is always meant to be not an end in itself, but a means to an end. And the end is obviously love. And so if I wield my authority, as the king, it's to exalt her as the queen. Because, even if I think I'm usually right, I might have the right answer, but I hardly ever come out saying it in the right way, at the right time, but she always translates my knowledge into wisdom because she knows the kids, she knows their hearts, she knows their strengths and weaknesses. So I learned that when I take my authority as the head and I defer to her as the heart, she's always capable of not only translating what I'm trying to say, but she's also able to kind of function as a prophetess and say, I think this is what you mean. And in my pride and in my insecurity, I'm like, that's not what I said, and all of that. So again, hundreds of times where I make the mistake, you begin to really catch on and develop a habit. The third and final thought that I have comes from a friend of mine who works with me at the Franciscan University and here at the St. Paul Center, Dr. John Bergsma, a brilliant biblical scholar, perhaps the greatest Catholic biblical scholar of this next generation, I'm convinced.
Wow.
And he's given a talk on a number of occasions. In fact, he's working on a book right now dealing with marriage, living out the sacrament of matrimony. And the way he illustrates this principle of male headship and the woman as the heart is by pointing out how a man is meant to lead a woman in dancing, ballroom dancing or whatever classical dancing you might think of, because he's clearly the one who is meant to lead, but she is the one he intends to showcase. So it's not his beauty. It's not a narcissist kind of leadership. He is leading her so that everyone can see her grace, and her dignity and charm. And so if a man understands that he has headship and authority, it's basically to kind of showcase her. And so I've also learned this with my own kids when we're not dancing, but we're in the kitchen or whatever. The more I show respect and honor to her, the more my kids just bask in it. The more affection and respect and good humor, the more I defer to her in matters that aren't necessarily, moral or immoral. I just feel as though it just contributes immeasurably, exponentially to the harmony. And let me just rewind for a moment to put things in a realist tone, because when we moved here in 90, before I learned that lesson, I think people were sort of surprised in our neighborhood at how strained our marriage was visibly. I mean,
how strained?
Strained.
Okay.
Yeah. There were a lot of stress lines, fault lines, because I had become a Catholic in 86. She didn't become one until 90, and I wasn't sure she ever would. And once she did, I thought, well, happy days are here again. But I mean, I think our neighbors would have given our marriage about a 50-50 chance, especially in the summertime when the windows were open. I've got a set of pipes, and I don't always play happy tunes. I had to learn the hard way, and now I would say it's the grace of the sacrament. It's God's fault that we're so blessed. It's her fault as well, and I'm just, again, the caboose that is learning mostly by mistakes that I make. But I think that's true for a lot of men, especially in our culture where, masculinity is reduced to toxic masculinity, or it's a kind of absenteeism that is just easier to kind of avoid any confrontation, which means really avoid any direct engagement as husband or father.
Thank you for watching this clip. You can click here to watch the full episode. And I want to say a big thanks to our sponsors and to our amazing patrons for making all of this possible. Please do us a favor before you go. Click that subscribe button and then the bell. And that way YouTube will be forced to let you know every time we put out a new episode.